So I'm going to invite people to come up a little closer. We've got a lot of space in here, and people will wander in, but I want to make sure that we're nice and cozy. We're going to leave time to open it up for questions as well. So start thinking about what you may want to ask in terms of questions. And Isaac here has a microphone at a point. I'll let him know it's time to come out and gather up your inquiries. So let me just start by saying I'm Gero. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for the County of Los Angeles, and I'm also the former President of the Climate Action Reserve, the host of this conference, and current Vice Chair of their board. And it's great to be back. I don't get involved in these issues as much as I used to, and it's nice to come and see everybody and be part of the conference. So I appreciate the Reserve inviting me back to moderate today. I think the program was advertised to include a representative from Washington State, Chris Davis, but Chris was called to the legislature at the last minute. Today is the last day of their legislative session, and they've got a priority bill that they're trying to wrangle up the final votes for, and they've done some great work in Washington State, and we want to make sure that they have that last little cherry on top of their pie. So unfortunately, we don't have Chris, but we have an excellent panel. And starting from my left, and your right, if I get that right, is actually Conrad-Saydah with the California Environmental Protection Agency, who's been there for, I don't even know how long now.
Almost 7 years.
Almost 7 years. We go back a ways. And will talk to us about the work that California is doing and its interrelationship with other states and regions. And then to her left is Philipp LaHaela Walter with the state of Hawaii, and they've been doing some very interesting work, very progressive work in Hawaii, so I'm looking forward to talking to him and hearing from him about the work there. And then on my far left is Snyder with the Department of Environment in the state of New York, a longtime advocate and environmentalist who's been doing great work there as well. Of course, New York is one of the leading states in the United States on climate issues, and so we'll hear from him as well as what's going on in New York. And you just heard that, of course, in the plenary if you were there. But we're going to get into a little more detail on the interrelationship of New York State with some of the other initiatives in the other states. So I'm going to start by asking Ashley to just give us a quick overview of what's going on in the state of California today, given the change in the gubernatorial administration, how the priorities have changed, if at all, and what we may be able to get in some insight into new initiatives that may be coming forward. So, Ashley, if you want to start us off.
Great. Thanks, Gary, and thanks to CAR for inviting me back to speak, and all of you for being here. Hopefully we can make this as much of a dialogue as possible. So as Gary mentioned, we are in the middle of we have already completed a government changeover, but still in the middle of getting accustomed to all the new members of the Newsom administration, bringing a lot of new people into the fold, and making sure that we're able to clearly describe what we're doing in the climate policy realm and making sure that we can continue our work and potentially even increase our work over time. So hopefully you all heard Jared Blumenfeld, my new boss, speak yesterday, the Secretary for Environmental Protection, and he did a good job of outlining the 3 ways in which the Newsom administration will continue and expand on the work of California since the inception of AB 32 a long time ago. So the 3 ways he talked about was doubling down on the commitments that we've already made and ensuring that we reach our climate protection goals. And from my perspective, what that means is, for example, we put out a draft Natural and Working Lands implementation plan in January. And the goal now is to ensure that we have even bigger goals in that plan. By working with some of the new members of the administration, we'll be looking at the numbers we put out in January and draft and saying, how do we finalize these and potentially even double some of the numbers in there? So that's one piece of work that we're doing to move from the last administration to this administration and to potentially double down on our work. And that's important because natural and working lands have been largely a sidebar in our work, and we've focused on emissions in closed systems. And now we're looking at these open systems where there are a lot of no-regrets actions that we can take to improve those ecosystems, improve livelihoods in California, and really improve long-term climate outcomes. The second area that he talked about was thinking about climate resilience more. And, in large part, we've been thinking about climate resilience as an integrated part of mitigation, so that for every mitigation action you take, you get resilience and adaptation benefits. And what Jared was referring to yesterday, and what Kate Gordon also talked about, was really putting a bigger emphasis on risk and resilience and really helping Californians prepare for the impacts of climate change. And it's really important in the resilience work that we look at our partners around the country and around the world, because a lot of our other states and many of the states in the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is now at 23 members, have been doing really great work on resilience. So the partnerships have been incredibly important for us as we learn more about resilience. And then the third part that Jared talked about was also really bringing climate home to communities. So thinking about how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and criteria pollutants in the same action. So we're really improving lives at the neighborhood scale as we're really thinking globally. And I think Terry Tamminen touched on that this morning as well, or the video did too, but think and act locally and be scared globally. So be thinking big as you're actually taking your actions. So I would say those are the three major areas. It is more of what we've been doing and really ramping up more on resilience and adaptation and making sure that all of our dollars are aligned towards achieving multiple benefits in each action. So we're not just funding one thing at a time, but we're thinking of this integrated and holistic vision for climate action in California.
That's great. Thank you for that. More is more, so we want to see that for sure. And certainly given the kinds of wildfire and other events we've seen in California, the notion of risk and resilience is critical. We certainly suffered from that here in Los Angeles recently, but we know in Northern California it was even worse. So next I'm gonna turn to Philipp and ask a little bit about what Hawaii has been doing, but I want to preface it by saying when we had our planning call for this, he mentioned a sea level rise report, and I'd like, Philipp, if you would, to talk a bit about, in general, what's going on in Hawaii, what are some of the big initiatives, but really tell us about that sea level rise report as a island state. Certainly sea level rise is probably more critical to you than to most other states, if not all of the other states, and so I want to understand a little more about what that said and what are some of the policy responses to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a disclaimer at the beginning, I'm actually a forester by trade, and since this coincided with the end of our ledge session, I was kind of voluntold to show up here. And somehow I ended up, over the course of my short period of working there, as the carbon guy, and so it seemed to be a good fit to send me. So bear with me when I get a little bit caught up in details here. But the sea level rise report was a very powerful tool for us. It did raise a lot of awareness of what climate change actually means in the state. The sea level rise showed that the Honolulu tide gauge already shows nearly 1/2 foot of sea level rise since 1905. And it basically ran a few models and did these bathtub models that show what would happen if it would raise the 3.2 feet increase that is modeled or projected. And it came out to say that some 550 cultural sites, some 38 miles of major roads, which includes a lot of our highways. Very powerful images that went through our media was highways breaking off into the ocean already. We have these, we call them king tides that, that are just higher than and coincide with other variables and just create a lot of damage already, just with this 1/2 foot. And then I think the most striking number was that it summarized the number of economic damage to some $19 billion just by looking at a 3.2 feet increase in sea level rise. Maybe some of you have been at Waikiki. It's a really nice place to visit. but it's right at the beach. And that's kind of our economic hub. And this whole Waikiki area is like prime exposure area for sea level rise. So huge challenges there. And we're really glad that this report really, put this in numbers and made it very, very clear what that means. And that led to a bunch of really ambitious goals that were passed politically. Hawaii was the first state to officially sign on to the Paris Agreement and to achieve the net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We set up the Aloha Plus Challenge dashboard. It's basically a portal that you can access online that shows how are we doing in terms of reaching certain goals. And the state took a more comprehensive approach, not only focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We are already looking at what does all this mean for all the other sustainability goals by the United Nations. So you'll see a lot of these goals there, and you can really see the progress that has been made. And it just makes it very clear on how our performance is. In terms of clean energy, Hawaii is on track with achieving the state's 100% clean electric energy goal by 2045, trending of 26% renewable generation. And then the counties actually stepped up and set a goal for 100% clean transportation by 2045. We're currently importing 516 million gallons of petroleum. We don't have oil wells, but we have a lot of renewable energy, as you can imagine, in the subtropical area that we live in. And I think the most recent and probably the most ambitious goal is that we want to be a net carbon sink by 2045. So in order to achieve that, the state set up a couple entities. One is the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission. It's a kind of a high-level, multi-jurisdictional body that is making climate policy. And they're focusing right now on this ground transportation goal. Since we're in the energy sector, we're well on track. But the ground transportation is kind of what we need to focus on right now. So they're looking at electrification, increasing the infrastructure for charging electric vehicles and so forth. But they also promote legislation for disclosure for private property to public offerings located in areas with potential exposure to sea level rise. So you're actually obliged to say when you sell a property that it is in these areas that are going to be impacted. Wow. So it's already implemented to affect the price basically of these properties and the interest in these properties. They request all new development, redevelopment, and modifications to be directed away from beach areas, urge counties to incorporate the 3.2 feet sea level rise exposure area into their general and development plans, and then encourage agencies and non-governmental utility providers to identify and prioritize assets within the 3.2 feet areas. So kind of no-brainers in a way, but really important policy measures to mitigate this and react to this crisis. And then the other entity that was set up was the Greenhouse Gas Sequestration Task Force. I'm a member of that entity. And that really focused on the land sector, where the commission focuses on industry and transportation. We are focusing on the land sector. That's kind of my expertise is in forestry. So I'm, kind of really active in looking into how can we increase the carbon storage per area on the land sector, both in in forestry, but also in agriculture. We're looking at agroforestry, we're looking at silvopasture, and even at aquaculture for increased sequestration. And I think there is the collaboration piece really strong. This entity is collaborating with the United States Climate Alliance. They have the Natural and Working Lands Challenge open right now, and this commits the member states to improve inventory methods, to identify best practices, and advance programs and policies and incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase resilient sequestration. There is a report on the way, or like a study that is going to end into a report looking into a carbon offset program. It's really vague at the moment. It's not really sure, will it be a compliance thing or will it be a voluntary carbon offset program? But we are all looking forward to get a little bit more clarity once this comes out. And then the commission actually ended up recommending a carbon fee to be implemented. However, all three bills that included a carbon fee died in this session already, so it looks like there won't be any carbon action this year anyway in the legislature. And then I'm working on a couple of forest carbon offset programs or pilot projects that I'm happy to give some more details.
So we'll talk about that. So thanks for that. That's really interesting. And despite the lack of a fee, you guys are doing a lot of great work, the clean energy work and all the rest of the transportation. And you think about electric transportation in an island where I would think distances aren't as great as other places, but I happen to have a factoid that the county of Los Angeles physically is the same size as the big island of Hawaii, and it's a big county, and it's you can't actually drive from one end to the other and back on a single charge. So there are challenges for sure, at least today. So Jared, I know we heard from you kind of already about what New York was up to, so maybe you can start us on the path of the alliances and the interconnections with other states, and tell us some of the work that you're doing with with the Climate Alliance, as well as we understand the potential expansion of RGGI and where that stands.
Okay. Why don't I touch on the Climate Alliance for a moment? I think it was like within 24 hours of President Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. Governor Cuomo joined with former Governor Brown and Governor Inslee to start the U.S. Climate Alliance back in June 2017. And this now consists of 23 governors, as Ashley mentioned, that are united to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And these states are working together on a number of strategies. Philipp mentioned the natural and working lands. That's one of the big areas where we're really learning from each other, so building capacity by working together. Another area is short-lived climate pollutants. These are the pollutants other than CO2 that are really important, particularly in the short time frame. Two really important ones are methane and hydrofluorocarbons, and the states and the Climate Alliance are working together on strategies to reduce those emissions. I'll come back to that at the end and focus a little bit on what New York is doing. In 2017, my department, the Department of Environmental Conservation, joined with some other departments in New York State and developed and produced a methane reduction plan, which is a strategy of 25 policies to reduce methane emissions in New York. It's focused on three sectors: the oil and gas sector, the waste management sector, and the agricultural sector. And it's really a combination of carrots and sticks that altogether will result in significant reductions in methane emissions. And most of those 25 initiatives are underway. Some are already completed. Let me touch on a few of the examples of what we're doing. In oil and gas, DEC my department is developing a regulation that will impose stringent new requirements on the oil and gas industry to reduce methane emissions. Now, in New York State, we have very, very little production. So we're not talking, for the most part, reducing the methane emissions from wells. The governor has banned fracking in New York State. And this was a state where, has a significant amount of resources that could be harvested, natural gas, and the governor said, no, keep it in the ground. But so what we're focused on is primarily the emissions in the transportation and distribution of natural gas from compressor stations, from pipelines, from various other equipment along the way. And we believe we're putting together, among the strongest, if not the strongest, set of regulations in the country. We've gone out to stakeholders, got stakeholder input, and we're preparing the formal regulatory proposal, which should come out later this summer. In the waste management area, one of the areas of focus is capturing methane emissions from landfills and reusing that methane emissions to produce energy. But before we even get there, if we can reduce the amount of organic materials that go into landfills, and those are the materials that really break down and provide most of the methane, that will significantly reduce the emissions from waste management. So this year, the legislature passed a bill to establish a organics diversion program. There's really a few elements of this. One is in the area of food waste, large food producers. If the food is usable, use it for donation. Donate it to food banks and the like. And that's for usable food instead of just throwing it all out. And then second is what is really waste, what cannot be used. Let's keep it out of landfills. Let's send it to digesters. Where it can be converted to renewable natural gas that can then replace fossil natural gas or compost the waste. And so that's going to be a significant part of the strategy of reducing methane emissions from the waste management sector. In agriculture, our focus has really been on the carrots rather than the sticks. Not so much in the way of regulatory programs and regulatory mandates, but educational programs, incentive programs to help agriculture use practices that result in lower emissions. And this particularly the dairy industry that we're talking about. So reduce the emissions from the dairy industry, capture the emissions that occur. Again, waste can be digested and renewable natural gas can be created. And that's a big part of the focus on the agricultural sector. At the same time, we're also working with agriculture to develop practices that increase the sequestration of carbon in the soils. So with the goal of agriculture really, instead of being part of the problem, it becomes part of the solution to climate change. And that sort of is a bridge to the natural and working lands piece that Philipp mentioned. We're also developing regulations to phase out the use of hydrofluorocarbons in various uses. These are modeled on the federal SNAP program, the Significant New Alternatives policy that was adopted by the Obama administration and is being abandoned by the Trump administration. And this is where the Climate Alliance states got together and said, let's do these regulations ourselves. And California led, as often but not always happens, and So California adopted the regulations. New York is developing regulations. I'm sure if Chris was here, Chris would mention that Washington, just in the past week, adopted or passed legislation to implement these programs. And so this phases out the use of HFCs, a really potent warming agent in refrigeration equipment. To me, it's very similar to the states adopting the California car standards. That, when California adopted the zero-emission vehicle mandate and other states joined that drove the development of an electric vehicle industry in New York State. And now people in all the other states can buy electric vehicles as well. And I think similarly with our implementation of these HFC programs, we're driving the industry in the right direction in a way that we can, it really substitutes for federal action. So that's really just an example of the power of states working together.
Great.
Comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add in too that you have 3 states sitting here who are somewhat the usual suspects in taking action to protect the environment, to protect residents. The beauty of the U.S. Climate Alliance is that we now have members all over the country. So Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, Virginia, they all joined since we formed in June. And hearing from them on weekly calls about the work that they're doing in their states is really, really powerful. To hear someone from Nevada talk about the work that they're doing to reduce vehicle miles traveled is amazing, right? That's not the first thing you would expect. And so the power of partnerships is really having a place for everyone to share their best practices, to learn from one another, to celebrate these big and small victories on the types of legislation and policies that we work on, and to really show that we truly are still in and we're not alone. So before we had the U.S. Climate Alliance, I think we were all united potentially through the Under 2 MOU, maybe at the Conference of the Parties meetings, at conferences like this. But now we have this weekly convening where every state has an opportunity to voice what they're working on. And then we have these learning labs where we have not only the state's representatives coming, but also nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, others to come and teach the states about these best practices and ensure that we can save time in the policy development process by all learning together and adopting similar policies. And ultimately, that will save money for manufacturers, for businesses, for industries around the country who want to co-locate in multiple states around the country. So it's a very powerful alliance, and one that I think will survive even if we get the much needed transition to a Democratic president, or just a smart, logical president who understands that climate action is good for all of us. It doesn't matter which party you're from. So I think that the Climate Alliance has proved its value in a number of ways, in what Jared's talking about and what Philipp's talking about. I mean, we all know one another and work together all of the time. We also put out joint press releases so that we can really reflect on how silly these federal actions are and in hurting industries and economies in our states. So you're hearing all of the specifics, but the real power is the people coming together and basically making these pathways go a lot faster. So the action we've seen in the less than 2 years since the Alliance formed is monumental.
That's great, yeah, and I appreciate the little bit of that background on it. That was actually where I was going to head with my next question, so you've anticipated it well. The ability to move markets, I think, is critical, and Jared, I appreciate that you touched on that by bringing parties together that are working in a consistent fashion for some of these things. So we heard a bit about short-lived climate pollutants. We heard about natural lands. Maybe a little bit about transportation. What are some of the other things that the Climate Alliance is working on that are critical that you think that will actually help move some of those markets? And I throw this out to everybody and want to start a conversation here.
We have another energy efficiency piece that's taking shape, and we're talking in California about hosting a learning lab on energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. We get questions all the time about how we put in our appliance standards and what it took to get that done. So we've been talking with the Alliance Secretariat about hosting a learning lab specifically on what the path was that California took and how to maybe jump over some of those steps and just get to the end result. Right. We also have a really active transportation working group that actually Hawaii is incredibly active on from a zero emissions vehicle standpoint. The HFCs and short-lived climate working group that Jared talked about is very active too. Colorado and New York have really been leading that work, with California providing the framework for how we accomplish that. And then forest management has been a specific discussion within the Natural and Working Lands group, thinking about not necessarily avoiding wildfires, but preventive, healthy forest actions that all of us can take across our jurisdictional boundaries. And water has come up in bits and pieces as well. But honestly, we talk about pretty much everything. And markets do come up a lot. The idea of alignment of systems is very important. Even if we're not talking about linkage, aligning the standards and the practices within all of our markets to ensure that a ton of reduction in California is the same as a ton of reduction in RGGI. That's really important. We want to make sure that the standards are stable, easy to understand, and meaningful in any of the systems in which our states are working. So we do share a lot of information in that way.
That's great. Other comments on that point? Other things that you think are important to emphasize?
No, I think, Ashley sort of hit on it. I think there's, just a couple other areas of learning, right? There's a deep decarbonization. Yes. And carbon finance. In New York, we have a green bank that is providing a lot of private funding for the transition, and so that's just another of the areas where I think the states are learning from each other.
The deep decarbonization actually raises the next question I wanted to ask, and it's to you, Jared, which is, we saw, I think it was just this last week, the city of New York adopting its decarbonization standards for buildings. And we've talked a lot about appliances and vehicles and other sectors, but we have the existing building stock as well as new construction is really an area that has been hard to decarbonize. And I wonder, obviously I know you're not the city of New York, but if you can give us some insight into that program and how that might be replicated within the Climate Alliance as well.
I have to, I can't add much on what the city is doing, and that's something, I want to study and understand better, because it's obviously, a big part of our population, a big part of our building fleet is in New York City, and we need to understand how that fits into the overall strategies. For us, from the buildings I mentioned in the prior discussion, in the long term, what we're looking at is basically plugging those buildings into the clean electricity grid. Moving away, we have to move away from burning, oil and natural gas for heating. We'll never achieve our carbon goals if we're doing that. So it's making the buildings much more efficient, and then basically plugging them in, and a big part of that is ground source heat pumps to take advantage of geothermal energy to heat and cool our buildings, and that goes hand in hand with electrification. And I'm not sort of the engineer to understand all the details, but I know that's significant part of the strategy, and it's a work stream of our energy research and development agency that is putting a lot of effort in on the building side, because in New York, transportation and buildings have greatly surpassed the electricity sector in emissions. When I started, there was sort of 3 equal. It no longer is by any means.
Right. That's the last nut there to crack. I'm going to ask a last question, then I do want to open it up to audience questions because we have about 15 minutes left at this point. But really wanted to, I guess I would be remiss, given that the work that the Climate Action Reserve does and the market focus of this conference, to talk about the role of markets in each of your jurisdictions and the intersections of those markets. I know California obviously has a cap and trade. RGGI is a significant cap and trade effort. That never actually connected to California, and maybe that's fine. And I know, Philipp, you mentioned the sort of voluntary offset program. So maybe if you could just each take 1 minute and give us a kind of a sense of where your market-based programs are and how they may be connected to other states.
Okay, I guess I'll start. The governor, in his budget legislation this year, proposed the Climate Leadership Act, which establishes a process where we develop a roadmap to carbon neutrality and achieve our emission reductions, and develop the programs and policies that would get there. And it directs us to look at market-based mechanisms and look at partnerships with other states as among the mechanisms to get there. RGGI is certainly a good model. RGGI has been extremely successful, and part of why RGGI's been so successful is the benefits that it's achieved outside of, other than just reducing carbon emissions. I mean, the carbon emission reductions are tremendous, 50% so far, 65% by 2030, but we're reducing other pollutants, providing health benefits valued in the billions of dollars, economic benefits in the billions of dollars, actually reducing energy bills instead of increasing energy bills as a result of the program. And these are all independent studies that establish this. So it's really establishing a record of success. That's why it is a bipartisan program. 4 Republican governors among the 9 that are members of RGGI. What's not to like? It overcomes all the partisan barriers. And now we have 2 other states on the way to join the program, Virginia and New Jersey rejoining the program. So that's a record of success. We're working with the other states in the region to see whether something similar can be done in the transportation sector. There's a workshop next week in Boston that is engaging with stakeholders and experts to get their recommendations on developing a cap and invest approach for the transportation sector. We have the model of what's been done in California that we're looking at. There's a number of challenges, a lot of work that needs to be done. But the states in the region are working together, and again, it's a bipartisan alliance. States like Massachusetts, Maryland, Vermont, are heavily engaged and in many ways, among the leaders in the effort under Republican leadership.
Great, Philipp, yeah.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this year the carbon-related bills unfortunately died, and I think they started with a carbon fee of $15 a ton in the first year, and then they had these increments set up. And then we kind of have to wait for this report to come out, what the recommendations are in terms of a carbon offset program. Again, it's still very open on where the state will go. Personally, I hope that the option of a cap and trade will be re-evaluated also in that report. Talking to legislators, there seems to be this notion that a cap and trade is very complicated and requires a lot of resources that a small state like Hawaii doesn't have. And personally, I'm not so sure if that's true. So hopefully in that work that will be re-evaluated, and we will have a better picture and some
Great.
Better options there.
Great. Ashley, last word before we open it up.
Great. Well, I'm sure we have more experts on the cap and trade program in California in here than I am, so I'll just give a quick update. We did some regulatory amendments on the cap and trade program last year that were mandated by the passage of AB 398 in 2017. 2017. And through those regulatory amendments, we had a really great public process. We had independent emissions advisors weighing in on what needed to be in the amendments as well, and those were accepted at the end of last year. But now we're moving into this phase where the post-2020 program will be increasingly important. So the cap and trade program and our renewable portfolio standard and several of our other voluntary programs were largely responsible for us getting to our 2020 target 4 years ahead of schedule. But now we have this really difficult task of getting to 40% below the emissions levels at which we're currently sitting. And that is going to require a pretty steep decline of our cap. So our cap was declining at about 1% to 2% per year at most, and the cap now needs to go to 4% to 5% decline annually. So that's going to make a big difference, and we are concerned about affordability of that for California's residents and making sure that over time we're not putting an undue burden on our households. So we have, of course, been investing the proceeds from the cap and trade program in the types of systems that will actually help reduce the cost for Californians, in vehicle rebates, in housing weatherization programs, in transit-oriented development, so housing near transit, as well as the buses, bikes, and car shares that would support that housing development as well. And so to date, we've basically appropriated $9.3 billion from that program to assist Californians and assist the systems that, again, will reduce cost over time. But in this post-2020 time period, we will need to do a lot more. And we'll need to ensure that we have a number of companion policies that help actually get us to that 2030 target, so the cap and trade program doesn't have to do the bulk of the work. And so we have a plan to get to 2030. Cap and trade is a big part of that plan. But as we move towards carbon neutrality and past 2030, we are looking at ways that we can increase the opportunities for all of us to really get involved in the program. And again, that's a big part will be natural and working lands, because they haven't been part of our scoping plan and haven't been internalized in the work that we're doing to get to carbon neutrality. So I would say we're really looking at data as we move into the post-2020 time period to ensure that the system is working properly. What we always do with the system, we have independent auditors, we have tons of market advisors, and we have a lot of people watching the system to fill us in on whether it's working or not. So we'll continue to do that, but again, look really closely at especially that first compliance period post-2020 to see how that deeper decline is impacting our state.
Great. So with that, I want to open it up to audience questions. So if you have a question, this is your opportunity. Let's see, Andrea. It's got a microphone coming, so we can capture this for posterity.
Great summary from everybody. Thanks a lot. I took a lot of notes. Hawaii, you have a lot of abandoned or low value or whatever you call it, invasive covered lands from old sugar cane and pineapple plantations. What are you thinking of as ways to get that back into a better carbon sink? Do you have any policies or ideas on how to incentivize reforestation or other more beneficial uses?
Yeah, it depends on. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's a big problem that our state is facing. Is we do have these degraded areas through multiple decades of high intense use, and now they're kind of fallow. You certainly have to differentiate between the private lands and state lands. Private lands, one of our biggest agriculture company, A&B, just stopped producing pineapples, and they're moving towards a rate, I think it's called, REIT. So they become this, what's that?
An REIT?
Yeah, a REIT. And there is a speculation that they are moving towards getting these areas developed. They just sold a big patch to a Japanese agriculture company, I believe. So there's kind of mixed messages there. Obviously, the struggle over land in a very small place where everybody wants to retire is big. So this is kind of ongoing. But on the state side, we just ran an analysis on our lands. We have some 200,000 acres that are fallow, that used to be pristine native forest. And some of you might know, Hawaii is the extinction capital of the nation. We have by far the most endangered species in our state, and unfortunately, the most extinctions in our state. So that's a very, very big issue for us. So getting these habitats reestablished kind of drives our what we do right now. And certainly the reforestation mechanisms through forest carbon is something that we're pushing right now. We launched these 2 pilot projects, and we're hoping to produce some carbon offsets there within a couple years for the voluntary market. And then we hope that whatever the state decides on how to move forward with a carbon offset program, this will create this incentive statewide that is needed to get these areas reforested. Reforestation is really expensive. I really enjoyed John Nickerson's session on the Climate Forward program that totally touched on this. Not that we have to crack. Reforestation has these huge upfront costs, and how do we finance that with the revenue coming in later?
Great. Anybody else have questions? We've got a microphone coming around. All right, well, I've got a final question. I think we've got about 5 minutes, so if you can each take about a minute or so. Ashley, you'd mentioned a renewed focus on climate resilience and managing risk, and Philipp, you talked about, of course, I asked you to talk about the sea level rise report and the risks that faces. These are 3 coastal states, but it's not just sea level rise. Of course, we face other kinds of climate risks. So I guess the question I have for each of you is what can states actually learn from each other? We're not talking about appliance efficiency standards or vehicle standards. We're actually talking about managing climate risks, and are there shared lessons between states that can actually help drive the resilience through the 23 states of the Climate Alliance and beyond? I don't know. Who wants to go first? I'll leave it up to you because I think I surprised all of you.
I'll mention a couple of things. I do think that there is also a Climate Alliance work stream on adaptation that I have not been heavily engaged in, but that's another area where the Climate Alliance states are working together, learning from each other. There's a number of collaboratives like that where states can learn. Many states face very different challenges, but a lot of similarities. In New York, our primary focus has been sea level rise and flooding, and that's flooding sort of comes from 2 different directions. It comes from the sea rising and storm surges like we experienced with Hurricane Sandy, and then at the same time we have these extreme storm events where the water is sort of gathering in the watersheds and racing downriver and causing flooding in that way. Mm-hmm. And those 2 types of flooding require very different responses. And so that's an area where the states can learn from each other that face similar issues. I'm sure California probably has some of the same flooding issues as well, and obviously Hawaii with sea level rise. One thing that sort of going back to the theme of the Trump administration backing away from things, there was a committee called the Federal Advisory Committee for the National Climate Assessment. There was a group of experts that were that would provide advice to the National Climate Assessment and how the information from the National Climate Assessment that a group of federal agencies produce on climate trends and like how to put that into practice. And that was disbanded by the Trump administration. And so Governor Cuomo, working with the American Meteorological Society and Columbia University, put the group back together, added some new members, and that group produced a report a couple of months ago that is really focused on empowering states, municipalities, other communities, private communities, to improve their understanding of climate risks and how to respond to those climate risks, because it's really very complex, and it's a way for experts to learn from each other and build the capacity to respond to the changes that we know are coming. And we're starting to see in a big way sometimes.
Right. Philipp, Ashley, jump in.
Yeah, I think an important piece that we can all learn from each other is how we can all help communities prepare for the inevitable impacts of climate change. The impacts will be different. It might be, extended extreme heat days. It might be flooding. It might be a seismic event that is a stressor that is exacerbated by climate change. There could be any number of things that our states will confront, and I think really coming up with the best ways to prepare communities for those impacts is the best way for us to share amongst one another. And New York's experience in Hurricane Sandy was actually really instructive in the way California approached our National Disaster Resiliency Competition application to address the impacts of wildfire in Tuolumne County. So it was a flooding event on the coast of an urban area that we took some of those lessons and applied it to a fire event in a very rural, dispersed county. And so I think it's what we need to learn is how you build capacity within those communities. The state cannot do everything. We can put in place funding streams and people and opportunities, but we really need to enhance the capacity within communities to understand the stressors coming their way, understand the values that they want to protect, and think about the ways that they want to either rebuild or reclaim areas after a stressor hits that community. So that's where I think we have a lot of opportunity, and we've been trying to do that as well. I think developing plans that are specific to one disaster type will not help any of us because it will take a lot of time and a lot of money. But ultimately, we need to design flexibility and capacity, again, within community members, within elected council members, that go well beyond the folks sitting within state government. So we're already doing a lot of that, but I think we can do even more over the coming years, before disaster, after disaster, to make sure that we're all much more resilient in terms of individuals, economies, and systems, ecosystems.
That's great.
I'm really glad you raised that fire issue, because what a lot of people don't know about Hawaii is that we have, if you look at the percentage burned every year compared to other states, we're right up there, if not higher than any other state in terms of wildfire burning areas per year. And our firefighters and land managers are collaborating closely with CAL FIRE, for example, to plan for these events and to increase the resiliency of these potentially impacted communities.
That's great. That's really interesting. Yeah, so much to learn, so much more to talk about. I think we're at time. I'll look to Isaac. Yeah, he's nodding his head. So I'm sure if you do have questions, the panelists will hang around. And thank you all very much for coming. And thank you very much to the panel.